So I hope you're all having a good weekend so far. I'm sorry it's warm in here, and I'll try not to speak for too long. We're carrying on today our series looking at Ephesians, and we'll read from Ephesians 4 in a few moments. Are there any Toy Story fans out there? Toy Story? No, okay, so it's not just me. It's quite like, I was looking at it as I was preparing for this, and I was scared myself somewhat by how long ago the original Toy Story came out. It was like 1996 or something, Toy Story 1, so, oh, seriously, that feels like no time ago. In Toy Story 2, right, there's this moment when they're in Al's toy barn, and Buzz Lightyear is walking along past the aisles. In fact, he's running from one end to the other, sneaking past them, and he walks past one aisle, and then suddenly you watch him back up a bit, and he turns around and looks and realises that he's looking at this, like a whole aisle of Buzz Lightyears just there, and he's like, wow. And you kind of like, if you had Toy Story, and every single character in it was Buzz Lightyear, so you've got all these Buzz Lightyears here. The whole story was just about these characters on this aisle and none of the other characters. It would be really quite boring, wouldn't it? So it would be completely, have no diversity, you wouldn't get all those clever plot lines. If you didn't have Woody, if you didn't have Jessie, if you didn't have Bullseye, Rex the Dinosaur, Mr. and Mrs. Potato Head, etc., Slinky Dog. I know, worrying too, but we've got young kids, right? If you didn't have all of them, it would be a really quite boring story. If it was just Buzz Lightyear interacting with different versions of himself, it would be really, really quite boring. It's the diverse cast that brings it to life. And when it comes to Christians, when it comes to those of us who are trying to follow Jesus, we're not all meant to be the same. We're not like meant to be a mass-produced toy where we all come off the shelf and you just get rows and rows of these people who look identical. So last Sunday we were looking at why unity matters. And last Sunday we particularly thought about kind of unity on that kind of wider scale, not just here in the local church. And to be honest, this Sunday, I'm not sure the passage particularly splits down like this, but this is kind of how I'm going about it. This Sunday we're probably going to be more thinking about unity in local church family here. And when we looked at how unity matters last week, we considered how it's rooted in the very heart of God. God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And then we're meant to be the representation of that oneness on earth because we're his body and he only has one body, Jesus' body on earth. But unity isn't the same as uniformity. Every follower of Jesus isn't meant to look identical. It would just be a boring beige when it's meant to be this kind of beautiful array of colours. And that's true in terms of all kinds of dimensions. It's true in terms of like the literal diversity of people, in terms of personalities, in terms of cultural backgrounds, nationalities, etc. But perhaps another one too that I think this passage today particularly draws out is it's also true in terms of the way that God gifts us to serve other people. That there's a whole diversity of gifting and we need that whole diversity and variety. So Ephesians 4, we're going to read eventually from 7 to 16, but initially I'm just going to stop at the end of verse 10 to just explain some things. You'll see why in a moment. But to each one of us, grace was given as Christ apportioned it. This is why it says, when he ascended on high, he took many captives and gave gifts to his people. What does he ascended means, except that he also descended to the lower earthly regions. He who descended is also the one who ascended far higher than all the heavens in order that he might fill the whole universe. So we'll pause there for a moment because otherwise you'll just be thinking about what those last two bits we read are all about as we carry on. So in verse 8, Paul is quoting here, when he's talking about the whole descending thing, he's quoting Psalm 68 from the Old Testament, and essentially he's using this quote to point to Jesus in his resurrection and ascension up on high, as the victorious head of the church. He's raised higher than all demonic forces and principalities and powers, and he proceeds in his victory to then give gifts. And the picture to have in mind is a little bit like how in the ancient world, after a battle, after you've won a victory, you then distribute the spoils amongst your army. So that's the kind of picture that it's alluding to. Paul then goes back on himself and talks about descending. So it kind of goes backwards in time, basically, and people have interpreted this in different ways. But by far the most likely interpretation is that Jesus is referring to the incarnation, that Paul's referring to Jesus' incarnation here. That's when Jesus came to earth to live amongst us. So just to help you get that in mind, we're talking here about, initially, gifts for everyone. So in a moment we're going to see, as we carry on in the passage, it lists some particular leadership gifts with reference to the church, but he starts in a much more general sense because he says, but to each one of us, grace was given as Christ has apportioned it. So grace is God's unmerited favour. It's what God does for us that we don't deserve in any way. And the grace here is different to saving grace. So we were singing about that earlier on as we sang Amazing Grace, perhaps most obviously, it came out in other songs we were singing as well. And it said earlier in Ephesians, when we were looking at this back earlier, in fact it was last year that we looked at this bit, it said it's by grace you've been saved through faith, and not from yourselves, it's the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. So his saving grace essentially means that anyone who puts their trust in Jesus can be saved. They can be rescued from their sins and restored to relationship with God. And sin's not just doing stuff wrong, it's also the reality that we've each made the decision to turn our backs on God. We've missed the mark with how we've gone about living our lives. And this isn't something you can earn as a gift. This isn't something you can earn, it's a gift. It's freely available to anyone who chooses to follow Jesus. So that's available to anyone here this morning who's not yet made a decision to give their life to Jesus. That's open for you. This grace is available for you. And the grace described in this passage, though, is a little bit different. Here we're talking about grace being given in terms of different gifts being given to all who follow him. So in the original language, in the Greek the New Testament was written in, grace is charis, and the gifts are charismata, and that's where we get the word charismatic from. And although it doesn't use the word charismata here, the word for gifts is not used in this passage. It is used in other passages where there's kind of similar lists of things going on. And also, it kind of immediately, having said this, goes on in the text to talk about Jesus ascending and then giving gifts to men. So it's quite clear that he's got gifts in mind when he's using that word grace there, both from the connection in the word and the context of the passage. To try and help us understand this, David Devenish, who's founder of the Catalyst network of churches that we're part of, although he's kind of more recently handled the leadership of someone else, he says this: the ministry gifts referred to in this section are given by the ascending Christ to his church for this purpose. They are gifts of grace each believer has received for service according to the sovereign apportioning of Christ. It's important to note that this section starts with each believer, not with leadership gifts. The gifts referred to in verse 11, which we haven't actually read yet, it might have been helpful if we've done that, but never mind, a bit late now. We'll read that in a moment. Are gifts for people to the church, unlike the other gifts, other lists of gifts, so you get other lists of gifts elsewhere in the Bible, which comprise of gifts of some kind of supernatural endowment to individual Christians. So the list of gifts that we'll look at in a moment are gifts of people to the church, whereas the other gift lists you get in the New Testament are some kind of supernatural, empowering gifts that come to individual believers. So every believer, just focusing on this every believer bit before we look at the rest of the list, every believer has received grace from God to serve. Now, in the kids group recently, they were looking at what gifts they had. They're talking about what gifts and talents they have. We're so grateful for our kids leaders, by the way. They do such an incredible job serving our kids week in, week out. We just hear continually positive things going on. So the other week, they're looking at gifts and talents, and they're talking about the gifts and talents they have. So one of them said dancing, another cricket, another football. Someone else, wait for this one, had the gift of drawing triangles. Particularly like that one. But perhaps my most favourite of all was dear little Fran. And dear little Fran had the gift of jumping, which I think is a particularly special gift to hold. And what I love about this is I'm not just sharing this because it's kind of cute and amusing. Children have an ability to recognise gifts that I think is quite healthy sometimes and we can learn from in terms of recognizing that God's given us something to use for the good of other people. For sure, there are kind of more specific gifts, and we'll look at that list in a moment. But here we're getting at this general sense that there is this grace. There are gifts given to each of us to serve in the kind of much broader sense of thinking about it. So what grace, what gifts has God given you to be able to serve others? And we're just going to kind of almost park that one for a minute, and that's where we'll come back to at the end, kind of when we kind of come to respond at the end of the meeting. So gifts given to equip everyone to serve. So just reading the next verse, it says, so Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors and teachers to equip his people for the works of service. And again, we'll carry on and read the final bit of the passage in a moment. I felt today like it would be helpful, although it will take a few minutes to do this, just to run through what each of those terms mean, giving perhaps a little more time to the ones that are perhaps harder to get our heads around than others. So he gave the apostles. So in the Bible, we see apostles like we have the 12 apostles who were appointed by Jesus himself. And then we have Paul, and actually quite a few others are also named in the Bible. So we have Timothy, Silas, Barnabas, Apollos, James, the brother of Jesus. And we would believe here in this church and the network that we're part of that while the 12 apostles and Paul have a unique role to play, they're kind of like the capital A apostles, if you like, and they have a unique role because they met with the risen Christ. And they've had a unique role in contributing to writing and overseeing the scriptures that we have today in the Bible. We would still believe that there is a role for apostles today, more in the form of the kind of small A apostles that you see in the New Testament. So there's a number of apostles that you see in the New Testament that never met the risen Lord Jesus Christ. But they're still described as apostles. Beyond that, as well, they're listed here in a list with all the other giftings that we would believe function today. So there's never a reason given as to why this gift would have ceased to exist. So, from our understanding, apostles are fathers. They care not just for one church, but for multiple churches. They help plant churches and break into unreached people groups. They're foundation layers. They ensure that good, solid foundations are put in place and maintained within churches. They provide ongoing oversight and input. They help churches connect to the wider mission of the church all around the world. They always seem to carry a concern for the poor and helping make sure churches they're working with get connected into that. And in the Bible, I think this is one of the key ones that I think people sometimes miss. In the Bible, we always see apostles working together. It's really hard to find an example of an apostle who wasn't travelling with other people and had other people working beside him. And I think that's where this gets a bit messy sometimes these days, is when you get like some individual who declares himself apostle and kind of creates a situation where he has all the power and the authority, whereas a much healthier system is to think much more in terms of team. So that would be how like our network of churches is structured, for example. There is no one person who's like the apostle sitting at the top. There's a team of people, all of who do work like apostles. And what's more, we don't give any of them the name apostles. We just think that's likely to end up going wrong if you start going around calling people apostle this or apostle that. We don't tend to give people those names of any kind. So, for example, I don't expect people to call me pastor or whatever, Pastor Dave. No, I'm fine with just Dave. So for us at Emmanuel, Matt Partridge, who leads our sending church back in Oxford, he plays this role of providing the apostolic support into our church to make sure that good foundations are being laid here, to help us make sure that we're kind of breaking the ground in a healthy way. And we don't, like I said, we don't call Matt like Apostle Matt or anything, but we involve him intentionally in what's going on here to try and help ensure the health of this church plant. And this for us is really important because we believe like all churches are meant to receive this kind of input. And I don't want to be anti other churches where they might call it other things, they might give it other names, but I think that kind of input is really significant and really important. Secondly, prophets. Don't worry, as I go through this list, I think I'll spend less and less time on each one as I go, because I think they get easier the further you go down the list. There's a difference between prophecy and being a prophet. So prophecy, in its simplest terms, is hearing God and passing it on. It's about telling something that God brings to mind, basically. Elsewhere, we get in Paul's teaching to Corinth, Paul explains that actually you all can prophesy. And Jesus himself says that we're all to expect to be able to hear his voice. However, like the idea of hearing God speak to us and prophecy, just like sharing one or two things that God's saying, isn't the same as being a prophet. So for someone to be a prophet, that's more about someone who moves in that gifting consistently, has shown to be a person of good character over time, has a really good proven track record with what they're sharing. And I think the prophetic people who are actually prophets do more than just sharing prophetic words for other people. They have a gifting to draw other people out into their, so to help other people learn how to hear God, to help other people be drawn into other spiritual giftings as well, I think. So, for example, we've had someone called Wendy Mann come and speak here a few times. I'd say that she's a gifted prophet, and she has that ability, more than just to share a few prophetic words over people, she has the ability to draw other people into it. Just to say with prophecy, like, we're very clear in this church that we believe the Bible has the final authority. So when we're talking about hearing God, it always has to be weighed against what we read in the Bible. Carrying on the list then, evangelists. I'm always slightly nervous about using the word evangelism or evangelist. It's a Bible word, and so I've got no particular issue with the word really. It's just the image that it conjures up in people's minds can be kind of off-putting. So I don't know what you think of when you think of evangelist. For me, my most natural picture in my mind, that's probably not the most helpful one, is to immediately think of someone like Billy Graham and like speaking to thousands of people in stadiums, and there is a really powerful thing around that, and like some people do seem to have that gifting where they can speak to thousands and thousands of people and it transforms lives. Like it's amazing really actually when you speak to people, perhaps a certain generation, the numbers of them who came to faith, joined Billy Graham in like speaking in that kind of season of our nation, and that's an incredible thing, and some evangelists can do that. But here again, the emphasis is more on people who have the ability to equip everyone else to share the gospel. It's not so much about them just sharing the gospel, it's that they've got the ability to equip other people or everyone in the church. Because really, sharing Jesus is all our job, not just one person's job. It's not like you have like one person who's really gifted in it and you try and gather everyone else to come and hear that one person. That's not really the picture you get in the New Testament. The evangelist's job is to equip everyone else for works of service. So their job is to train us in how to share the gospel. It was great to hear from the front earlier when Bethany shared about speaking to her hairdresser this week. Actually, I was thinking about it. I think I heard a story just another week ago about someone else talking to their barber, so there's clearly a bit of a theme there, which is great. And it's just exciting to hear that we're taking more and increasing responsibility together to share our faith. I wouldn't consider myself an evangelist, although having planted a church, I do often hear like the Apostle Paul's words to the young Timothy ringing in my ears, which is like, do the work of the evangelist. And I've often taken that to think, okay, part of my job here in doing the work of evangelist is not just to share my faith with other people, which I'm trying to do, but also to take really seriously how do I equip us as a church to be sharing our faith. I had a really good conversation this week actually. I'm often quite awkward when it comes to sharing my faith with others, but I try to give it my best shot. This week while having coffee with a friend, he's just going through a really, really tough time. And I just, if I'm really honest, just reached a point where I just did not know what else to say to him. And like really, it shouldn't need to get to that point before I start sharing the gospel. So I found myself doing a thing called the 3 circles. It's just a simple way of explaining the gospel of Jesus to someone. And we chatted some more, and having done that, he was like, actually I've been praying, and like, could you tell me more about how to pray? And we just, like, he wasn't ready to give his life to Jesus or anything there and then, but it was just a really powerful conversation. We're going to meet again next week. It's amazing actually when you start those kind of conversations, you realise far more people are open to having them than you think, and there's far more people living in tough places and brokenness who are just in desperate need of hope breaking into their lives. The evangelist equips others. That's what I was going to say about it. Like part of what I said in that conversation I was able to explain the gospel clearly, partly because someone who really was an evangelist equipped me to know how to do that. I wouldn't have known how to do what I shared with him if an actual evangelist hadn't shared that with me and helped me with it. Pastor teacher. Pastor in some translations is shepherd, which is arguably a more helpful translation because it begins to help you think about what that might look like in terms of feeding the flock and caring for the sheep, etc. And the final two on this list, pastor teacher, some would consider them to be one gifting. Some would consider them to be two separate giftings because of the grammar in the original Greek puts the pastor and the teacher somehow closer together. I don't understand grammar in English, so I've got no chance in the Greek. So if you look at what I've written in my notes here, you'll see that I have no understanding of English grammar. So I've got no hope of really understanding it. But trusting what the commentaries say, it brings those two words closer together, almost like it's like one person with both of those giftings. And commentator John Stott, he helpfully explains that whether you see it as one or two giftings, it's clear that pastors, that is shepherds, who are called to tend to God's flock, will do so in particular by feeding it, i.e. teaching. So whether you see it as one or two, there is definitely a connection between those two giftings is the point. So these two would be where I would see my gifting lying, and I think most church leaders in the UK would see themselves in that kind of mould. I'm not sure if all would, but that seems to be the general kind of census. And again, though, I would say that we're in a situation now, currently as a church, where we're still operating as a church plant, so we haven't formally put leadership in place yet. But when we do that, we'd be looking to not just have one person who's playing that kind of pastor-teacher role in the church, but a team of people who together would play that role. Because again, we think that's the kind of New Testament model, and also I just think it's a healthier model for operating, to not give one person all of the control. So all the gifts listed here are actually people who are given to the church. Some of these people will be within our local church setting, others we need to invite in from outside to kind of further equip us and help us. And as we look to the year ahead, we're looking to bring in people with all of these different giftings actually, as visiting speakers over time, to help continuing to equip us. Even where we feel we have people who are gifted in that way already in our church community, it's helpful, I think, to have others come in from outside as well. So just reading the rest of the passage. So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors and teachers to equip his people for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up, until we have reached the unity in faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God, and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Then we will no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves, blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by cunning and craftiness of people in their deceitful schemes. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ, from him the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work. So we see here gifts that are given to bring about unity, not uniformity, to unite until we reach the unity in the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God. We spoke loads about that last week, so I'm not going to say much more here. I'm going to say I do wonder if sometimes churches struggle with unity within themselves because they're not receiving the gifts that they need into the church community that can help bring that unity about. I'm sure that's not the only reason, but I wonder if sometimes churches are struggling because they're not receiving the gifts that God encourages us to receive in. Put another way, for us here, it's really important as leadership here that we're open to a whole variety and diversity of gifts coming in, because nobody has it all. Quite frankly, only Jesus has it all. And so we need to invite those gifts in here to work towards local unity. Secondly, God's gifts are given to bring about maturity. Just to let you know, I've been really kind there. I realise it's hot and I have a lot more I can say on that one. God's gifts are given to bring about maturity. So looking at the passage again, the other thing these gifts of people are meant to do is bring about maturity. And it's not individual maturity so much as a kind of corporate maturity that we're talking about here. And this maturity looks like a number of things. So I'm just going to run through 4 things. Firstly, clarity on what we believe. I enjoy the passage not being tossed about by every new idea that comes along. So a new trend of theological thinking comes along and go, oh, follow after that one, oh, that one looks good. But actually having some kind of a stable foundation on which you build. Secondly, speaking the truth in love. Jesus was 100% love and 100% truth. He was the one who was able to do this perfectly. And as we grow to become more and more like Jesus, we should be, as a sign of maturity, get better and better at being able to speak the truth in love. Something that our society is terrible at, where we've got an opportunity to display something really different. Natural growth of the church would be another, so it talks about building itself up. It's never a sign of health if something doesn't grow. Any natural thing, if it's not growing, it's probably not a great sign. And while I think there's a much bigger picture here than numerical growth in view in this passage, what is clear is that just maintaining the status quo is a sign of immaturity and non-maturity. We're not just talking about numerical growth, we're talking about growth in every sense, like being able to speak the truth in love, growing in how we're treating one another, growing in how we're serving the city, etc., etc. So growth is a sign of maturity. I want to land on one final point, really, is everyone a minister. So often we've tended to really quite unhelpfully think about pastors or other key leadership roles in the church. We use unhelpful phrases, don't we, like being called into ministry. Whereas actually, biblically, we're being taught that everyone's a minister. So we learn in this passage, God gives grace to each one of us to serve. And God gives the gifts of people, apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers. These people don't do the ministry, they equip people to do ministry. So verse 12 says to equip these people for works of service. Some translations even go with works of ministry, which would be perhaps a more literal translation of the original. So what does ministry look like? Well, it certainly doesn't just look like Sundays. We're the body of Christ, we're His church all the time, everywhere we are. The equipping we're meant to receive, the giftings that God gives us, aren't just limited to church services. They're to expand and to grow His kingdom into every area of society. So real ministry looks like encouraging someone after church on a Sunday, but it also looks like encouraging someone in your workplace on a Monday, or standing by the school gate, speaking and encouraging that parent who's really struggling. So real ministry looks like diligently putting the chairs out on the Sunday. Thank you guys who did that this morning. It also looks like working really diligently at your job, even though you don't enjoy it, and working as if you're working for the Lord Himself. Real ministry looks like gathering to pray with a few Christian friends. It also looks like daring to offer to pray for that friend who doesn't know Jesus, who's in need of healing. Real ministry looks like daring to step out and share a prophetic word from the front. It also looks like bravely sharing the gospel with your friend who doesn't yet know Jesus. Emmanuel is family, and everyone in this family is a minister. Unity but not uniformity. We need a diversity of gifts, and every part of the body of Christ matters. So two just quick fire takeaway points really. Firstly, God has given much for you to bring to the table. Don't write off what you have to bring. You have a voice, you have a significant part to play. The church is described as a body. Every part is needed, every part is unique, every part matters. Whether you're gifted in encouragement, hospitality, drawing triangles, or jumping, we need it in this church community. There is a part for absolutely everyone to play. One beautiful way I think to think about this is, rather than seeking out how you can use the gifts that you think you have, is to reverse it and think in a Jesus-like way, who came not to be served but to serve, and think about where are the opportunities for me to serve, and then seeing if you've got the gifts to fulfill them. I've often discovered that people, when they do that, they discover they're gifted in ways they never even realised. Whereas we go about thinking in a more kind of where's the need for my gift, for the thing that I'm good at, it can lead to more serving our ego than actually serving other people, because we're talking about grace to actually serve other people and minister to other people. Secondly, don't let comparison kill your joy. Let's spur each other on. Comparison is an absolute thief. It robs you of so much in your life. It lures you into unhelpful thinking. It can trick you into thinking that someone's doing something to harm you who's doing nothing wrong at all. They're just getting on with their gifting and you're annoyed about it because you want that gifting. I've seen it happen again and again, watching people getting annoyed with other people who haven't done anything to harm them at all, but really you can just, it even comes out sometimes in quite plain language, that they're just annoyed that they're not doing what that person's doing, or maybe haven't even got the gifts and skills to do what that person's doing. It robs you of joy and can lead to you ultimately hurting others if you let that kind of come out of you, as it were. For sure, it's not wrong to wonder if God might want to use you in some new way. It's a good thing to explore giftings you might have, but don't let comparison to others rob you of joy or hurt anyone else. I'm just going to invite Stephen back up and Joanna. We're going to sing again in a moment. So Jesus came not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. And Jesus is both our model and our means for living this out. He's the model because he came to serve and he demonstrated what that looked like. But he's also the very means by which we can serve because he gives us the grace to serve. He doesn't just give us grace to rescue us and save us, he empowers us with his grace to serve. And so much more as well. We could talk about the empowering of the Holy Spirit, etc., etc. It means that, his grace is powerful. And we're going to sing here a song called Build My Life, and some of the lines in it go like this: show me who you are, and fill me with your heart, and lead me in your love to those around me. Which is a beautiful picture of how we receive God's grace and love in our lives, and that equips us and enables us in turn to use that grace to serve others, because he is always the ultimate source of that grace. So if you'd like to stand, we're going to sing, and then we'll play and do some song.